Hi everyone, Rachel Jank here with a tutorial video that can help your students build skills and attitudes of inquiry for your classroom. Today we're going to focus on something called 20 questions when you start a text. And one way to promote inquiry with students is to have moments of writing questions whenever you start any text. Kelly Gallagher in Deeper Reading calls this 20 questions, and he uses it at the start of a novel unit as one way to model to his students what good readers do when they start to read. This exercise directly opposes the narrative of, if I ask a question, then I must be stupid. And this exercise reveals that in reality, asking questions is a good thing. It helps us track our thinking. Additionally, when we ask questions, we can learn to sit with these unanswered questions, as uncomfortable as that might be. But what does it look like to guide students through this activity of asking 20 questions at the beginning of a text? Can we just tell them, hey, ask 20 questions after you read chapter 1, put it in your notebook, I'll check it later? From my experience, and I definitely did that, so this is actual experience. From my experience, students can need more support, especially if it's the first time they do this type of intensive question asking. 20 questions sounds like a lot to some kids. Maybe it sounds like a lot to you. So there are several ways to give students support to help them ask 20 questions, and I'd like to go over some of those support ways today. So we can assign a smaller portion of a text to ask 20 questions with. Of course, we can read it in class, do think alouds, do a gradual release of responsibility. First chunk of text, I read it out loud. I show you what I'm thinking. I read another chunk of text. You in small groups ask questions. You do the third chunk on your own. We can also give some categories to students that may be helpful, some categories to help build their questions, to show them what kinds of questions that they can ask. But we need to use this sparingly because we don't want to assign, write 5 questions about setting. We want to see what questions do you have about the setting. Finally, one thing that we can help students do as they learn to develop questions when reading is showing them how to take confusions and conclusions they've already made and turn those into questions. So I'm going to take you through a short text to show you how this can be done today. So this is a text from one of my favorite books, which is A Wrinkle in Time, and we are going to read 2 short passages. Again, this is an example of, here's one short chunk of text, and then we'll come back to another chunk of text. So I'll start. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzied lashing of the wind. Behind the trees, clouds scudded frantically across the sky. Every few moments, the moon ripped through them, creating wraith-like shadows that raced along the ground. The house shook. Wrapped in her quilt, Meg shook. She wasn't usually afraid of weather. It's not just the weather, she thought. It's the weather on top of everything else. On top of me. On top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong. Okay, so as I read through that text, I have a couple of questions that come up instantly. And one of the questions that I have is, why is Meg's bedroom in an attic? That seems like not a great place to sleep. So that pops in my mind. And another one is, why is she doing everything wrong? And another question is, what are all the wrong things that she's doing? So I took one segment of text, if you notice, the on top of me, on top of Meg Murray doing everything wrong, and I picked that space in the text and I asked 2 questions, a why question and a what question. Why is she doing things wrong? And what are the things that she is doing wrong? So that's my think aloud for this first section of text. And at this point, you could also have students pause and write down their questions. We are going to go to the next section of text, and I'll have us pause and write down some questions after that. School. School was all wrong. Ooh, I get one of my answers. She'd been dropped down to the lowest section in her grade. That morning, one of her teachers had said crossly, "Really, Meg, I don't understand how a child with parents as brilliant as yours are supposed to be can be such a poor student. If you don't manage to do a little better, you'll have to stay back next year." During lunch, she roughhoused a little to try and make herself feel better. And one of the girls had said scornfully, "After all, Meg, we aren't grade school kids anymore. Why do you always act like such a baby?" On the way home from school, as she walked up the road with her arms full of books, one of the boys had said something about her dumb baby brother. At this, she'd thrown the books on the side of the road and tackled him with every ounce of strength she had, and arrived home with her blouse torn and a big bruise under one eye. So at this point, I would like you to pause this video and write down your list of questions according to those two passages. You can just skip back, push pause, so you can actually read them on the screen and see if you can come up with 20 questions. Another way to do this is to see how many questions you can come up in, say, 2 to 3 minutes. So go ahead and pause. I'll write my list, you write yours, and we'll see what we come up with when we come back together. Okay, so perhaps 20 questions on 5 or so paragraphs is a lot to ask. I, in the last couple of minutes, got about 10 that I was able to do. And when we have our questions down, again, this is a great option to do a think aloud and just to start revealing to students that questions can take different kinds of lines of thought or lines of inquiry. And we can look at, okay, how many questions did I have that were related to this setting? How many why questions did I have versus what and who? How many questions did I have that could be answered with one word or a simple phrase? And how many are more complex? The purpose here is not to prove whether or not I ask good questions. The purpose is to consider what kinds of questions can I be asking? So reveal that there's a whole plethora of questions, simple and complex, that come up when we start reading a text. In fact, we can ask questions that have already been answered in the text because sometimes we just forget. And that's what readers naturally do. The first time they read a text, their brain can't store all the information. So by asking these questions, I can also look back and say, like, oh, they already said how old Meg was or what school she went to or something like that, what subject she was struggling in. So that also reveals to students that you don't have to be perfect readers the first time through, which I think is so integral as we teach our students to be good readers. So speaking of categorizing our different questions, one of the things that we can do to help students who are struggling with writing questions is giving them some categories. So maybe we don't say write 20 questions that you have about the first few paragraphs or the first chapter. Maybe we say, let's write some questions about what Meg is thinking about herself. And so this is also a great way to weave in literary devices, especially if you just introduced one in class and you can say, you know, that internal, I have it as internal thoughts, but that internal dialogue or internal monologue, what is Meg thinking about herself? What questions do we have on that? How does the author describe the setting here? Target those sentences. Okay, what questions do you have about this setting? So I had one like, why is Meg's bedroom in the attic? What questions do we have about different characters? What different characters have we met so far? And we go through all the characters and say, what questions do you have about those? Like, people said some very rude things. So I could ask questions about the teacher, the girl at lunch, the boy after school, and then ask, are people just rude at her school? That could be a question too. So by breaking down into this simpler, more focused question, we can show students, here are elements in the text that we can ask questions about. Additionally, one of the things that I really like to do is reveal to students how their confusions can turn into questions, because I think that many of us as readers tend to feel a mass of confusion when the book starts. And for those of us who are good readers, we know how to sit with those confusions. And we also know how to ask questions out of those confusions. And this is something that we can teach students how to do. So by showing them what confusions they might have, or by having students list off their confusions and showing them how that can transform into questions, we can teach students that confusion is natural and should be brought up in class. It is not shameful. It is not aggravating. Good readers take their confusions and use those confusions to ask questions. So we have, you can even use sentence starters here that help sometimes. We have, I don't get how, or I'm confused when, or I got lost when. So I got lost when Meg said that there was a girl at lunch that made fun of her. So I don't really know what she was talking about then. So maybe that reveals to us our students are having trouble picking up the subtle shifts in setting change. But they can turn those confusion statements into question statements. What's going on when? Where did so-and-so go? Where did the teacher go? Why do you think is another great way. I got confused when she was talking about the girl at lunch. Why do you think that the girl at lunch said these things to her? And then did the general, what's up with this? What's up with that girl at lunch? Sometimes our students come to class with that, and that will spring us right into, let's return to that page. Let's ask that question. And then what's the point of? What's the point of Meg saying these things? What's the point of talking about her brother being made fun of? And so that's a very vague question, but it needs to be asked so that students can start to track their thinking, and so that students know that in order to answer questions, we need to return to the texts, or we need to turn to our peers. And then finally, we can look at how we make conclusions at the start of a text and how we can turn those into questions. So one reason that we may find ourselves struggling to have questions is because we've already made up our minds on things. Contextually based conclusions are great. Those text-dependent analysis conclusions and claims are awesome, but often we make strong statements in our thinking to make it seem as though we know what we're talking about because we are uncomfortable with being unsure. These are also called assumptions or biases. We stick to them. We don't like to change them. So if my students seem to be making a lot of quick conclusions, then we do this exercise, turning conclusions into questions. This helps a lot with small group stuff too. Sometimes they don't know what questions to bring to small groups. Well, let's talk about our conclusions, our assumptions, make questions out of them, and then be open to what your group members say. So I really like this exercise because it teaches us to allow our assumptions to be incorrect or to be temporary. They don't have to be wrong, but they're allowed to shift. Maybe we can also learn that we can make a conclusion, make an assumption, and then move forward with an expectation to learn more. We don't have to hold on to it with rigidity. So we can practice being a little bit skeptical of our own conclusions through this exercise. And I think that this type of skepticism might be at the heart of inquiry in my experience. So the way it works is this. Students might make out of those first few paragraphs some conclusions like Meg's teacher is awful, or Meg likes to fight because it says that she roughhoused and she got in a fight after school. So then I will ask students, well, what's a different perspective? What could somebody else say? Well, maybe Meg's teacher is exasperated in general. Maybe Meg has had issues with these classmates before. So we start with conclusion or assumption, counter perspective, what might a different perspective on that be? And then how can we ask a question which really invites those counter perspectives to speak? What interactions does Meg usually have with her teacher? And we can ask that at the beginning of a novel, and we can track the answer as we go through. Maybe we'll get a different picture of the teacher. And then the question that I actually posed earlier in my list, but we can do here as well, does Meg have friends in her own class? So the conclusion doesn't have to go from Meg likes to fight to does Meg like to fight? I mean, that is a question, but we want to try and push past to a question that includes lots of different perspectives. So sometimes this will take a lot of scaffolding, but again, I find it's a good way to just start practicing pushing back on those conclusions and assumptions that we tend to make. So there it is. 20 questions, scaffolded some different ways. Hopefully you found something that you will be able to use in your classroom or that can help your students ask questions as they start a text or at any time when you're going through a text in class.